The official civics narrative is a comforting myth. Look at the raw data from the 1976 presidential election. Jimmy Carter, an outsider, sweeps into power promising to cleanse the Washington establishment. Yet the mathematics of his transition team exposes a glaring glitch. 20 of his highest appointments were pulled directly from the exact same private club of just 300 people. This statistical impossibility shatters the illusion of grassroots democracy instantly. You are exhausted. You spend your digital life fighting endless culture wars online, aggressively arguing over red versus blue, convinced that the next election will finally fix the country. But the actual supply chains, the global interest rates, and the foreign policy vectors are decided years in advance by people who never run for office. Your total ignorance of this bureaucratic network makes you a predictable, highly manageable node in a geopolitical algorithm you do not even know exists. It is time to throw away the tinfoil hats and look at the cold, unforgiving mathematics of power. I'm going to teach you how to read the interlocking directorates graph. This is the hidden operating system of global politics, stripping away the theater of partisan debates. Once you understand the structural overlapping of these elite corporate boards, you will be able to accurately predict government actions regardless of who occupies the Oval Office. You will finally see the strings. Inside a dimly lit server room, the glow of multi-monitor setups illuminates a massive digital corkboard. This is a murder board, powered by code. The geopolitical network analyst stares at the center of the screen, where a photograph of the White House anchors the data set. Red lines shoot outward, connecting the Oval Office not to American voters, but to a dense web of multinational banks and defense contractors. The lines converge on a single, massive node labeled the Trilateral Commission. To the analyst, this visualization is not a conspiracy theory. It is the autopsy of a political system. The corpse on the table is the high school version of representative democracy. The data confirms a chilling reality. The system is structurally captured by pre-existing corporate networks before a single ballot is even cast. The voting public is simply auditioning a middle manager for an executive board that has already finalized its strategic agenda behind closed, soundproof doors. The paradox begins with a specific political crime scene. In 1976, the American electorate was traumatized by the sweeping corruption of the Watergate scandal. They desperately wanted a savior from outside the swamp. Jimmy Carter actively campaigned on the explicit promise of being a pure Washington outsider. He was the antidote to the establishment, a man uncompromised by the entrenched bureaucracy, promising to return the government to the absolute control of the people. But the moment the outsider took office, the algorithm of power corrected his trajectory. Upon crossing the threshold of the White House, Carter immediately appointed Zbigniew Brzezinski as his national security advisor. He then selected Cyrus Vance as his Secretary of State and Harold Brown as his Secretary of Defense. The electorate cheered for a fresh start, unaware that the core architecture of their new government had just been franchised out to a deeply entrenched private entity. The geopolitical analyst types a query, running a probability matrix on these three specific appointments. The result flashing on the screen destroys the narrative of coincidence. Statistically, the probability of drawing three men for the absolute top three geopolitical posts from a single private policy group of roughly 300 global members by pure chance is less than 0.001%. This was not a random selection of the best talent. This was a hostile takeover. The logs reveal the origin of this invisible gravity well. This private group, the Trilateral Commission, was not some ancient secret society operating in the shadows. It was founded just 3 years prior to the election, in 1973, by billionaire industrialist David Rockefeller. A brand new node had been injected into the network, and within 36 months, it successfully routed the executive branch of the United States through its own private corporate servers. Through the analyst's eyes, you see how power actually functions. It is a strict mathematical topology. When you map the board of directors of a major bank and cross-reference it with defense contractors, you are looking at the neural pathways of a shadow state. These technocrats do not need to rig voting machines or steal ballot boxes in the dead of night. They simply ensure that any viable candidate must plug into their network to access campaign funding and institutional credibility. The political process you participate in is effectively a sandbox. It is an aesthetic ritual designed to give the population a sense of agency, while the actual macroeconomic parameters are strictly defined by overlapping corporate directorates. You are allowed to choose the color of the car, but the destination was locked into the GPS by a central committee years before you even arrived at the dealership. The Trilateral Commission engineered the perfect, legally sanctioned bypass of public will. We are left staring at the flashing red lines on the server room monitors. The evidence points to a massive, systemic consolidation of power masked as a democratic transition. The official narrative tells you that presidents shaped their cabinets to reflect the mandate of the voters. But the cold, hard data of network graph theory exposes a completely inverted reality. The cabinet is the permanent fixture, the immutable core of the system, and the president is merely its temporary spokesperson. This brings us to the ultimate glitch in the historical record. A contradiction that demands a complete reevaluation of modern American history. We call it the Jimmy Carter paradox. The data forces us to ask a highly uncomfortable question. How does a completely uncompromised, anti-establishment outsider manage to build the ultimate insider establishment cabinet purely by accident? The cynical mathematical answer flashing on the screen is brutally simple. He doesn't. The flashing red lines of 1973 did not appear in a vacuum. To understand why David Rockefeller built this private algorithm to capture the White House, we have to rewind the tape exactly 2 years. We need to look at the economic crime scene that forced the architects of global wealth into an absolute panic. You were taught that billionaires act out of cartoonish greed, but the truth is far more dangerous. They acted out of pure, existential terror. Look at the archival footage of August 1971. The screens distort. The tape physically warps under the pressure of the moment. The United States unilaterally severs the direct international convertibility of the dollar to gold. With a single television broadcast, the Bretton Woods system, the very foundation of the post-war global economy, is completely annihilated. The trading floors descend into primal chaos. This is not a market correction. This is the bedrock cracking. Your high school history books probably glossed over this event as a dry footnote about monetary policy. That is a massive misconception. For the people who actually owned the infrastructure of the world, 1971 felt like the apocalypse. The fixed anchors of reality had snapped. Suddenly, the value of everything was floating in a dark, unpredictable void. The elite were flying blind, and the control mechanisms they had relied on for 3 decades were suddenly offline. The situation rapidly degrades into a lethal, compounding fracture. Fast forward just 24 months to 1973. The geopolitical board flips again as the OPEC oil embargo strikes. The price of crude oil quadruples seemingly overnight. We see the lines at gas stations stretching for miles, but the real trauma is happening on the macro level. The system is hit by a paradoxical disease that economists call stagflation, simultaneous economic stagnation and runaway inflation. Stagflation is the ultimate economic anomaly. It is a virus that traditional fiscal medicine cannot cure. If you try to fix the unemployment, you pour fuel on the hyperinflation fire. If you try to crush the inflation, you flatline the entire labor market. The official narrative suggests that governments naturally figured a way out, but the raw data from that era tells a completely different story. The governments were paralyzed. The sovereign states were bleeding out on the operating table. Against the stark silhouette of the Manhattan skyline, David Rockefeller analyzes this cascading failure. He realizes a terrifying truth about the architecture of global capital. The three main engines of the industrialized world, North America, Western Europe, and Japan, are completely out of sync. They are acting in blind, competitive isolation. In their panic to save their own localized currencies, they are steering the entire planetary ship directly toward mutual, guaranteed destruction. The paradox here is brilliant and terrifying. The very democratic institutions designed to protect the nations are causing the crash. National parliaments and the United States Congress are far too slow, too fragmented, and too concerned with local re-election cycles to manage a synchronized three-continent economic meltdown. To the observer in the boardroom, democracy is no longer a political ideal. It has become a fatal lag in the system. The latency is literally killing the market. The solution cannot exist within the bounds of the United States Constitution, because the Constitution was designed for the 18th century, not for the speed of light. Rockefeller and his core group engineer a supranational stabilization algorithm. This is the true genesis of the Trilateral Commission. It is not a cabal plotting in a smoky room. It is a high-level administrative sync engine. Its sole purpose is to align the macroeconomic policies of these three massive global regions. You have been programmed to believe that public legislation drives global change. You are wrong. The Trilateral Network was explicitly designed to bypass the slow, unpredictable nature of elected bodies. By placing the most powerful bankers, media moguls, and defense contractors from Tokyo, London, and New York into a single private feedback loop, they established a unified protocol. They could predetermine interest rates and trade flows months before a bill ever hit a parliament floor. This is the cold, hard mathematics of elite consolidation. It is not a conspiracy. It is an emergent property of network theory. When the sovereign governments failed to stabilize the volatile energy markets of 1973, the private sector simply built a redundant control system layered directly over the top of them. They patched the bug in the global economy by removing the most unstable variable in the entire equation. That unstable, highly dangerous variable was you. The archival tape continues to warp and snap as the gravity of this shadow infrastructure sets in. This supranational alignment was so effectively constructed that within just 3 years, it would seamlessly catch a peanut farmer from Georgia and hand him a pre-packaged cabinet. The politicians were allowed to keep the podium, the flags, and the television cameras. But the actual levers of survival, the control rods of the global reactor, were quietly transferred to private hands. We are standing at the epicenter of the 1971 fracture, watching the old world burn and the new algorithm boot up. But securing the economy was only phase one. The architects of this network quickly realized that stabilizing the currency was completely useless if the population was allowed to continue voting for chaotic, unpredictable social policies. The citizens were still demanding more rights, more oversight, and a larger share of the pie. The system was still at risk. To permanently secure their new architecture, they needed to fundamentally rewrite the rules of human freedom. They needed a manifesto. I found the exact document, a completely unclassified white paper that reads like a declaration of war against the voting public. They did not hide their intentions. They printed them, bound them, and distributed them. The elites concluded that the ultimate threat to civilization was not communism or hyperinflation. The ultimate threat was democracy itself. You were told that the ultimate threat to civilization was a foreign ideology or a collapsing currency, but the architects of the new global order identified a much more dangerous pathogen. It was you. To secure the financial architecture we just uncovered, they needed a specialized intellectual weapon. They needed to systematically neutralize the voting public without firing a single shot, and they left the exact blueprints sitting in plain sight. Through the eyes of our archivist, sitting in a climate-controlled vault, the truth is not hidden in shadows. It is illuminated by the harsh, fluorescent lights glaring off original typewritten memorandums. The heavy, rhythmic strike of a typewriter key echoes in the silence, punctuating every highlighted word on the page. Your high school civics textbook claimed that democracy is the ultimate goal of human progress. This document argues that democracy is a disease. The archivist stares down at a massive, unredacted white paper published in 1975 by the Trilateral Commission. It is titled simply, The Crisis of Democracy. It was authored by three highly respected academics, Samuel Huntington, Michel Crozier, and Joji Watanuki. This was not a fringe conspiracy pamphlet. This was a diagnostic manual commissioned by the most powerful financial nodes on the planet to assess the health of the Western world. The official narrative programs you to believe that a republic thrives on maximum civic engagement. But as the archivist reads these yellowing pages, a profound, cynical paradox emerges. The authors looked at the massive social upheavals of the 1960s, the civil rights movements, the anti-war protests, the sudden political awakening of vast demographic groups, and they did not see a triumph of freedom. They saw a catastrophic system overload. The report explicitly argued that this sudden surge in political participation created what they termed an excess of democracy. When minority groups, students, and laborers began demanding their fair share of the economic pie, the system began to buckle. Statistically, as voter mobilization expanded by millions across different social and racial demographics during the 1960s, the governing elite realized that fulfilling these diverse demands would bankrupt the state. The logic here is as brilliant as it is terrifying. If every citizen is completely engaged and demanding constant legislative action, society becomes mathematically ungovernable. The technocrats looked at the raw data of public sentiment and concluded that a highly educated, highly active electorate is structurally incompatible with long-term capitalist stability. The very definition of a healthy republic was reclassified as a lethal operational hazard. A thick yellow marker harshly strikes through a specific line of text on the page, the sound scratching against the absolute silence of the underground vault. The archivist feels a quiet, profound exhaustion washing over them. There is a deeply unsettling fatigue that comes from reading the blatant, unredacted blueprints of control that the general public simply ignores. The smoking gun is right here, written in dry academic prose. The highlighted sentence from Samuel Huntington is a masterclass in intellectual arrogance. He wrote, and I quote, that the effective operation of a democratic political system usually requires some measure of apathy and non-involvement on the part of some individuals and groups. Read that again. The lead architect of your political reality stated outright that your republic only survives if a large portion of you simply stop caring. This shatters the great American misconception. You thought that low voter turnout, widespread political alienation, and the general feeling that your voice does not matter were signs of a broken system. You were wrong. This document proves that public apathy is not a glitch. It is an engineered feature. Your exhaustion, your confusion, and your ultimate withdrawal from the political process are the exact metrics of their success. To cure this so-called excess of democracy, the report proposed a radical surgical intervention. The solution was the rapid elevation of a new technocratic class. They needed a buffer of specialized managers, unelected experts, and central bankers who could enact deeply painful economic policies without ever being subjected to the immediate, chaotic pressure of public elections. They needed to sever the link between the economy and the ballot box. By outsourcing the core functions of the state to these insulated technocrats, the Trilateral Commission effectively quarantined the voting public. You are still allowed to debate social issues, argue over cultural values, and wave your flags, but the actual machinery of human survival, the interest rates, the trade agreements, the supply chains, was permanently moved behind closed doors. The democratic ritual was reduced to pure aesthetics. The archivist closes the thick binder of The Crisis of Democracy. The heavy thud echoes like a gavel dropping in an empty courtroom. The motive has been established, the weapon has been forged, and the target, your political agency, has been neutralized. But a blueprint is completely useless without an engineering team to build it. To execute this quiet coup, they needed a mechanism that transcended national borders and constitutional law. They could not just write a memo. They had to physically rewire the global corporate infrastructure to ensure that these technocrats always had the final say. This required a level of coordination that most sociologists thought was impossible. But if you know how to read the hidden architecture of power, you will see exactly how they built the cage. The answer lies not in political theory, but in the brutal, inescapable mathematics of monopoly. The brutal, inescapable mathematics of monopoly. You were taught that the United States Constitution is the ultimate operating system of power. But to the geopolitical network analyst, staring at multi-monitor arrays in a dimly lit server room, the Constitution is just legacy code. The real firmware of global control was written outside the bounds of any democratic framework. To build their insulated technocracy, the elite did not need to rewrite the law. They simply hacked the corporate structure. Watch the screens. A mesmerizing, terrifying, three-dimensional graph builds in real time. Millions of data points compile, rendering nodes that represent the Fortune 500 companies. Bright, glowing lines shoot across the digital void, connecting these massive conglomerates not to abstract market forces, but to single human figures. It looks exactly like a neural network firing in the dark. But this is not biology. This is the architecture of corporate monopoly. The official narrative relies on the sacred myth of competition. You believe that rival corporations fight tooth and nail for your dollar, keeping prices low and innovation high. It is a comforting fairy tale. The analyst isolates a single, glowing node on the graph and reveals a glaring paradox. How can one human being legally synchronize the behavior of three theoretically hostile competing megacorporations without triggering a federal antitrust investigation? The answer is hidden in plain sight, buried in the boring bureaucratic filings you never bothered to read. The primary mechanism of elite consensus is not a secret handshake. It is an entirely legal practice known as the interlocking directorate. This occurs when an executive from Company A concurrently sits in the board of directors of Company B. They do not trade briefcases in dark alleys. They sit in well-lit boardrooms, legally sharing the same oxygen, the same data, and the same goals. Let me shatter your illusion of the free market. When the same individual governs the strategic direction of an oil giant and a major international bank, those two entities cease to be independent actors. They become synchronized appendages of the same nervous system. Motive, opportunity, and means all converge around a mahogany table. The analyst filters the dataset, highlighting these overlapping seats of power, and the chaotic free market suddenly transforms into a tightly choreographed dance. You might think an overlapping board member is a rare anomaly, a mere rounding error in the vast economy. The data proves you mathematically wrong. Through rigorous graph theory analysis of the 1970s and 1980s, researchers isolated the true density of this web. They discovered that an astonishing 90% of major United States corporations shared at least one director with another major corporation. The system was essentially one giant interconnected boardroom. This 90% overlap is the smoking gun of structural capture. It is the baseline reality of corporate America. But the architects of the 1975 Crisis of Democracy report needed something infinitely more powerful. They needed to fuse this domestic corporate web with the economic engines of Japan and Western Europe. They needed a node so dense, with a gravitational pull so massive, that it could bend global macroeconomic policy to its will without asking for your permission. Enter the Trilateral Commission. The analyst zooms in on the absolute center of the digital graph, where the glowing lines become a blinding nexus of light. The Commission did not just write policy. It acted as the ultimate meta-board. By systematically placing individuals who already sat on the boards of titans like Chase Manhattan, Exxon, and Ford into the exact same room with their Japanese and European equivalents, they engineered an ultra-dense transnational network node. This was a masterclass in topological dominance. The elite effectively created a private superconductor for global power. While you were distracted by the theater of partisan elections, arguing over superficial campaign promises, the individuals occupying this meta-board were actively harmonizing the supply chains and interest rates of the entire developed world. They built a private consensus engine that operated entirely outside the jurisdiction of any single sovereign government. This structural density fundamentally breaks the mechanics of representative government. Because of the interlocking directorates, critical information and policy consensus travel exponentially faster through this private corporate network than through the sluggish public legislative process. The algorithms of power execute before a bill is even drafted. This velocity advantage renders the United States Congress effectively reactive, responding to economic realities engineered months in advance. Let that mathematical reality sink in. The elected officials you relentlessly champion, or bitterly despise, are perpetually trailing behind the data. They do not steer the ship of state. They are merely reacting to the waves generated by this ultra-dense corporate node. You have been programmed to believe that true power resides in the ballot box, But the network graph proves that your vote is nothing more than a delayed reaction to decisions finalized in closed, interlocking boardrooms. The geopolitical network analyst leans back as the three-dimensional model continues to spin, mapping out the true hierarchy of human civilization. The bright red lines of the trilateral metaboard do not care about your political affiliation. They care only about stability, capital retention, and systemic control. It is a flawlessly designed, self-replicating algorithm of elite consensus, executing its logic in total silence, while the public endlessly devours the noisy distractions of the media. This is the terrifying beauty of the graph. It is a perfect, bloodless mechanism for managing global democracy. But a machine this powerful cannot remain theoretical forever. Eventually, the technocrats had to flip the switch and test the true capacity of their newly forged network against the living, breathing economy. We are about to look at the exact moment this invisible structure pulled the trigger on the American middle class, mathematically guaranteeing an era of unprecedented devastation. We stand in a stark, brutalist room at the Federal Reserve. The air in this architectural bunker feels intentionally heavy, designed to intimidate. Look at the chair at the center of this mahogany table. The man who sat here did not just tweak a dial. He initiated a controlled demolition. The network graph we just mapped was no longer a theoretical exercise in corporate synergy. It was about to become a weapon of mass economic destruction, aimed directly at the American heartland. You were taught that economic depressions are tragic accidents, the unavoidable weather patterns of a free market. That is a comforting misconception. The statistics lie. What if I told you that the devastation of the U.S. manufacturing base was not a glitch in the capitalist machine, but a deliberate, precisely engineered protocol? We are looking at a financial crime scene, and the murder weapon is a localized spike in the cost of money, executed by a man who never needed your vote. The year is 1979. The United States is drowning in stagflation. The incumbent, Jimmy Carter, the supposed outsider, reaches into the exact same ultra-dense network node we identified earlier. He appoints Paul Volcker, a founding member of the Trilateral Commission, as the chairman of the Federal Reserve. This is the paradox you must digest. A democratically elected president hands the steering wheel of the global economy to a private, unelected technocrat. Why would any politician willingly surrender leverage over the currency? Because the network demanded a sacrifice that no elected official could ever survive at the ballot box. Volcker was not brought in to stimulate growth. He was deployed to execute the chilling thesis drafted in the 1975 Crisis of Democracy report. The elite needed a manager completely immune to the pressure of public elections, someone who could force a population to endure extreme, systemic pain. Volcker walks into this brutalist room and engineers a macroeconomic anomaly. He initiates what financial historians now coldly refer to as the Volcker Shock. The federal funds rate, the baseline cost of borrowing money that dictates every mortgage and business loan, is violently shoved upward. He does not stop at 10 or 15%. By 1981, he pushes the rate to a staggering, asphyxiating 20%. The financial oxygen is instantly sucked out of the room. This was a mathematical guarantee of recession. It is counterintuitive to everything you learn in high school civics. The government is supposed to protect your livelihood, right? You are programmed to believe that. But the graphs overlaying this boardroom table show a very different priority. When the cost of capital reaches 20%, physical industry dies. You cannot build cars, forge steel, or expand factories when the interest on your debt outpaces your profit margin. The resulting shockwave obliterates the manufacturing base of the U.S. Midwest. Stark, black-and-white photographs of shuttered steel mills and foreclosed homes flood the archives. This is the birth of the Rust Belt. Millions of skilled laborers are suddenly obsolete, standing in the longest unemployment lines seen since the Great Depression. The official narrative calls it tough medicine. The network graph reveals it as a targeted strike to crush the bargaining power of labor unions. By destroying the industrial working class, the Federal Reserve effectively silenced the very demographic that the 1975 report identified as possessing an excess of democracy. A terrified, unemployed population does not demand higher wages or strike for better conditions. They simply beg for survival. The algorithm of elite consensus functioned flawlessly. The Volcker shock amputated the economic mobility of the middle class to save the foundational value of the dollar. The sheer audacity of this operation is staggering. A single unelected node in the network intentionally crashed the economy to stabilize capital for the elite, proving that democracy is subordinate to the bank. If this revelation shatters your perception of history, hit the like button. If you are ready to stop arguing over superficial politics and finally understand the raw physics of power, subscribe right now. Do you think the middle class ever recovered? Tell me in the comments. You have to admire the cold, clinical efficiency of the maneuver. The technocrats proved their ultimate hypothesis. A centralized, insulated manager can rewrite the destiny of millions without ever asking for their consent. The politicians took the public blame, absorbing the anger of the electorate, while the true architects of the recession remained safely behind the impenetrable walls of the Federal Reserve and the closed-door meetings of the Trilateral Commission. This is why the network theory of power renders traditional political analysis entirely obsolete. You can track the campaign promises of 1980 all you want, but the true vector of the American empire was mathematically locked in the moment Volcker set that interest rate. The voting booth is a psychological pressure valve. The Federal Reserve boardroom is the actual engine room. Once you see the cables connecting the two, you can never look at a presidential debate the same way. Look closely at the faces in those archival photos of foreclosed homes. Those families believed they were victims of a mysterious economic downturn, a stroke of bad luck. They were actually collateral damage in a macro-stabilization protocol. The Trilateral Meta Board realized that preserving the international capitalist order required a domestic bloodletting. The algorithm identified the industrial working class as the necessary friction, and it systematically erased their leverage. We are witnessing the birth of the modern era. The Volcker shock fundamentally rewired the global economy. Capital became mobile, abstract, and heavily concentrated, while labor remained geographically trapped and desperate. The policies that followed in the 1980s and 90s were merely the aftershocks of this single autocratic decision. The technocrats proved they held the ultimate veto power over the American dream, and they executed that veto with absolute impunity. You might argue that this was a temporary measure, a drastic surgery that ultimately saved the patient. But that is the ultimate red pill I need you to swallow. The surgery never ended. The Volcker shock established the permanent precedent that monetary policy is immune to democratic oversight. It cemented the reality that when the interests of the corporate network collide with the survival of the working class, the network will always mathematically prioritize its own stabilization. This brutalist room at the Federal Reserve is the monument to that victory. The analog network of the 1970s successfully hacked the Republic, replacing the messy, unpredictable will of the voters with the clean, unforgiving logic of the yield curve. But as the decades progressed, even this level of human management became too slow for the elites. The system was about to evolve. The men in the smoke-filled rooms were preparing to hand their power over to the machines. The men in those smoke-filled rooms did exactly that. The heavy, rhythmic clatter of 1970s typewriters faded, replaced by the sterile, high-frequency hum of a modern, algorithmic trading floor. To the geopolitical network analyst standing in the center of this server farm, the evolution is terrifyingly clear. We left the era of human conspiracy decades ago. Look at the blinking server racks surrounding us. You're staring at the central nervous system of the 2026 global economy. The old men of the Trilateral Commission needed private flights and translation earpieces to synchronize their monopolies. That was version 1.0. Today, the elite no longer need smoke-filled rooms to control the world. They just need code. You were taught that power requires a face, a politician you can praise or blame. But the network analyst tracking the capital flow sees a completely faceless architecture. The interlocking human directorates we exposed earlier were just the scaffolding. Once the structure was built, the architects stepped away. They automated the consensus process, removing the weakest link: human emotion. The analog era of elite coordination is dead. Its function has been entirely absorbed by a new trinity, known on Wall Street as the Big Three index fund managers: BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. These are not banks in the traditional sense. They are colossal data processing engines executing the blueprint written in 1975 with ruthless mathematical precision. I need you to grasp the sheer density of this new network node. When David Rockefeller gathered his peers, they represented a fraction of the global wealth. The servers humming around us right now manage something far more absolute. The power has shifted from private think tanks to the cold, dark data centers of these three asset managers. They are the new masters of the universe. Let us look at the actual statistics. The Big Three collectively manage over $20 trillion in assets. That is not just a number. It is the gravitational pull of a small sun. They are the largest single shareholders in nearly 90% of the S&P 500 companies. You think you are buying products from competing brands. You are fundamentally wrong. Whether you buy a ticket on a major airline, deposit your paycheck in a mega bank, or purchase medication from a pharmaceutical giant, the ultimate beneficiary is the exact same network. The geopolitical network analyst watches the data visualization map merge into a single blinding point of light. The illusion of market competition is the greatest magic trick ever played on you. We have officially transitioned from the era of interlocking human directorates to the age of algorithmic passive investing. The boardroom debates are over. Software now automatically enforces corporate governance across the globe. An algorithm written in Manhattan dictates the energy consumption of a factory in Berlin and the supply chain ethics of a mine in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is how environmental, social, and governance standards are instantly hardwired into the planetary economy. It is not done through the United Nations or Democratic Assembly. It is executed by a few lines of code updating a portfolio weighting. If a sovereign nation refuses to comply, the algorithm simply starves it of foreign direct investment. No declarations of war are required. You are witnessing the deployment of an invisible, unelected planetary government. The voting booth you visit every 4 years is a nostalgic theme park ride compared to the raw kinetic power flowing through these fiber optic cables. The server farms of the asset managers dictate the survival of national economies before the polls even open. They own the mathematical bedrock of reality. I told you we were going to throw away the tinfoil hats. There is no shadowy cabal sacrificing goats in a basement. The truth is much more sterile and infinitely more dangerous. You are being ruled by a fiduciary duty to maximize shareholder value, executed at the speed of light. The system is rigged, yes, but it is rigged completely legally, in plain sight, through index funds. Remember the 1975 report? The panic over an excess of democracy? The technocrats finally solved their problem by financializing the entire corporate sphere and placing it under the automated control of 3 passive managers. They built an impenetrable fortress. Public opinion can no longer threaten the supply chains. The economy is mathematically insulated from your anger. The analyst tracks a sudden spike in market volatility on the monitors. A political crisis is brewing in Europe, but the algorithm barely flinches. It automatically rebalances billions of dollars across defense and energy sectors in microseconds, hedging the geopolitical risk. The system does not care who wins the election. It only cares about maintaining the structural equilibrium. This is the ultimate evolution of the network graph we uncovered. It grew from a private club into a self-sustaining artificial intelligence. It no longer requires human executives to scheme and plot. The logic of monopoly and elite consensus has been coded into the very architecture of the global market. It is a machine designed to survive any political upheaval you can throw at it. So, if the actual levers of power are safely locked away inside these humming black boxes, completely disconnected from the democratic process, what exactly are your politicians doing on television every night? If the algorithms are running the world, what is the purpose of the screaming pundits and the endless campaigns? That is the final, brutal psychological trick they play on us. So, if the actual levers of power are safely locked away inside these humming black boxes, completely disconnected from the democratic process, what exactly are your politicians doing on television every night? Look at the split screen of reality. On the right, a highly automated port in Los Angeles is offloading millions of tons of cargo in absolute, serene silence. On the left, your news feed is a screaming, chaotic mess of riots, culture wars, and existential panic. You were programmed to believe this chaos is a malfunction of the Republic. You think the system is breaking down because everyone is so angry. But the paradox is that this hyperpolarization is not a glitch. It is the most efficient security protocol ever designed. The purpose of the culture war is to keep you perpetually busy while the adults in the room manage the global supply chain. While you watch the left side of the screen, mesmerized by the flashing lights of another political scandal, the right side of the screen is where the actual math of civilization happens. And over there, in the realm of shipping manifests and central banking, there is no red versus blue. There is only the uninterrupted flow of capital. The noise on your timeline is a mathematical necessity to protect that silence. To understand how this works, we have to look at the biological exploit. The algorithmic nature of modern social media is driven by targeted dopamine loops. It actively incentivizes populations to fracture along cultural, racial, and identity lines. A 2024 demographic study of algorithmic engagement showed that extreme polarization metrics increased by up to 40% when users were fed content emphasizing identity threat. You are being harvested for your outrage. The platforms do not care about your ideology, they care about your engagement time. By pressing ancient fight or flight buttons in your brain, they turn your political identity into a predictable behavioral loop. The irony is that while you believe you are fighting a righteous digital war for the soul of the country, you are actually just feeding a server farm. This brings us to the ultimate political illusion. You are locked in a state of existential dread over social policies, convinced the other side is out to destroy your way of life. Yet, if you look at the legislative record, the core tenets of the technocratic state enjoy total, unwavering bipartisan support. The real scaffolding of power is completely immune to your cultural outrage. When it comes time to authorize an $800 billion defense budget, or to bail out a collapsing regional bank, or to rout global trade agreements, the partisan screaming suddenly stops. The votes pass seamlessly. The politicians who called each other traitors on morning television happily shake hands in the afternoon to underwrite the corporate networks we mapped out earlier. This is not hypocrisy. It is the flawless execution of a 50-year-old blueprint. The 1975 Crisis of Democracy report we opened in the archives explicitly outlined this tactic. The architects of your economy warned that an engaged, active citizenry was a fatal threat to global stability. They desperately needed a way to generate political apathy toward macroeconomic reality without explicitly banning elections. They found their solution in exhaustion. By overwhelming the public with perpetual, hyper-emotional micro-conflicts, the system guarantees that you will never have the energy or the attention span to audit the Federal Reserve or decode the index funds. Your capacity for rebellion is safely vented into a digital void. You are too busy arguing about bathroom policies to notice who owns the water supply. Your high school civics teacher lied to you. They told you that every debate moves the needle of justice, but the statistics lie. A massive academic study mapping over 1,700 policy issues concluded that the preferences of the average American have exactly zero statistical impact on public policy. Zero. The laws match the desires of the economic elite 99% of the time. Look back at the split screen. The screaming pundits on the left are the entertainment division of the defense contractors and the asset managers operating on the right. They are paid millions of dollars to ensure you never look away from the circus. As long as you are terrified of your neighbor, you will never demand accountability from the unelected boards that actually design your future. You are not participating in a democracy. You are participating in what sociologists call a behavioral sink. It is a closed psychological ecosystem designed to safely bleed off your revolutionary energy. When a rat in an overcrowded cage is stressed, it attacks its peers instead of the scientist who built the cage. The culture war is the cage, and the financial algorithm is the scientist. Every time you share a viral political meme, every time you post a furious comment denouncing a rival faction, you are doing exactly what the network graph requires of you. You are performing the aesthetic ritual of freedom while remaining entirely compliant to the economic baseline. You are a predictable node, firing exactly when the software expects you to fire, creating heat, but no actual movement. I tracked these data points across a decade of electoral cycles. The pattern is absolute. The louder the cultural panic becomes on the airwaves, the more wealth gets quietly transferred upward in the background. It is a perfect inverse correlation. The noise is a tactical smokescreen for the silence of the algorithm, a brilliantly wicked method to keep the technocratic engine running undisturbed. The illusion is complete. They have successfully weaponized your own morality against you, ensuring that the true architects of this reality remain invisible, cloaked behind the chaos of the 24-hour news cycle. If the sheer scale of this psychological manipulation makes you see the world differently, hit the like button and subscribe, because the final mathematical truth is even colder. The tactical smokescreen of the 24-hour news cycle fades as I pull you back from the noise. I am taking you out of the server room, away from the screaming pundits, and ascending far above the atmosphere. Look down at the planet. It is not divided into red and blue territories. It is completely overlaid with the glowing, pulsing lines of the corporate network graph. Millions of overlapping directorates and algorithmic trading routes wrap around the globe like a nervous system. It is a digital cage, but it is also a protective shell keeping a highly complex civilization from collapsing. It is terrifyingly beautiful, and it operates entirely without your permission. This brings us to the final verdict of my investigation. You cannot vote out an algorithm. That is the fundamental axiom of 21st century geopolitics. I began this case looking for a shadowy conspiracy born in 1973, perhaps hoping to find a cabal of evil men plotting in a dark room. Instead, I found something infinitely more cold and uncompromising: the ruthless mathematics of systemic efficiency. The true horror of the Trilateral Commission and the automated asset managers that replaced it today is not that they are breaking the law. The chilling reality is that they are the natural, perfectly legal endpoint of globalized capital. When resources are finite, capital will always organize itself into the densest, most insulated nodes physically possible. Power absolutely abhors a vacuum. We inhabit a hyper-connected world of 8 billion people, where global supply chains must execute transactions in milliseconds. In this environment, waiting for localized democratic consensus is a luxury the market cannot afford. It is mathematically inefficient for survival, so the system simply bypasses the voting public entirely. This is the hardest illusion for any citizen to dispel, but it is your required homework for reality. You must abandon the romantic notion of individual political saviors. There is no rogue outsider coming to dismantle the machine from within the highest office. The architecture of power was fortified against that exact threat over 50 years ago. The President of the United States, regardless of their party affiliation, is essentially a middle manager. They are a public relations representative hired to sell a macroeconomic equation that was solved by unelected technocrats long before the campaign even began. The debate stage is a job interview for a corporate spokesperson and nothing more. I have spent the length of this project tracing the evolution of this control structure. From the deliberate economic shockwaves of 1979 that crushed the middle class, to the silent algorithmic governance of modern index funds. The elite recognized that true democracy is volatile, so they engineered an operating system that renders your ballot mathematically irrelevant. The culture war you fight online is just the exhaust fumes of this massive engine. While you argue over manufactured social crises, the interlocking directorates quietly route trillions of dollars through the underlying graph. You have been fighting shadows on the wall, while the architects are busy reinforcing the foundations of the cave you live in. To reclaim your agency in this era, you have to fundamentally change your optics. You must stop looking at the ballot box as the ultimate lever of power. True freedom is no longer about recognizing which name is printed on a piece of paper. It is about reading the invisible code that governs your daily existence. You have to map the network for yourself. Look at the board members of the multinational corporations that manufacture your devices, process your food, and manage your retirement. You will find the exact same names overlapping again and again. You are not a citizen of a republic. You are a data point in a managed corporate ecosystem. Recognizing this cold truth is the first step out of the behavioral sink. I want you to test this axiom today. Pick 3 major competing companies and trace their top institutional shareholders. When you find the overlap, leave your verdict in the comments below. If this investigation shattered your old worldview, hit the subscribe button. We will continue to decode these structures together, one graph at a time, until the map is complete. The era of naive political participation is over. The blueprint written in 1975 has been fully executed, upgraded, and digitized into an autonomous web. The illusion of choice was successfully engineered to keep you compliant. The men who built this system are gone, but their mathematical legacy hums perfectly in the server farms of the modern world. The digital cage is locked, but it is made of transparent data, and data can always be read. You now possess the exact coordinates of the invisible machine that dictates your future. The case is closed, the illusion is dispelled, and the final equation is written on the board. Now you know the cold truth of global power. Live with it. Class dismissed.